On Press Perspective today, we take a look at the broader implications of the Trump administration's approval of the Yi administration's ambition for nuclear-powered submarines. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, November 11th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now, Seoul and Washington have yet to disclose in written format details of the discussion between their leaders during their bilateral summit on the margins of the multilateral APEC meeting late last month in the city of Gyeongju. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, it's great to have you here.
Thanks. Great to be here as always.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio with us. Steven, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
First up, Thomas, we will start with you. South Korea and the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, have yet to disclose their joint summit fact sheet. What has been shared about this thus far?
Right. So this is, the fact sheet from the U.S.-South Korea summit at APEC, and that's, 2 weeks ago now. We believe the Seoul officials around that time said they expected it to be, come out within a few days. Basically, this would be the details of both the kind of the trade agreements that they discussed and the sort of security cooperation aspects that were also discussed. And so, it was expected to be sooner, but some things holding it up, and we don't know exactly, the real specifics of what they're working out. But we have some kind of ideas based on what some South Korean officials have said. But, we know the trade, so it's the trade agreement side and the security cooperation side. And the trade outlines seem basically set. We're not hearing too much that's an issue, and that was kind of the lowering the tariffs from 25% to 15%, and the ways that South Korea would structure its investment of $350 billion in the U.S. And a lot of those basic framework had been worked out in advance, and then they kind of ironed out some key details at APEC. But the bigger issue is the security component, and it sounds specifically around the nuclear-powered submarines that Washington has apparently approved for South Korea to build, and they're just issues about where they would be built and the details about the use of nuclear fuel and the technology transfer. Mostly we're getting this info from South Korean officials. Foreign Minister Cho Hyun talked about it on, before Parliament and on a radio interview this weekend. Defense Minister An Gu-bak talked about it on the radio. And they're saying, they're sort of framing it as kind of a coordination process among different U.S. agencies, which is very possibly, you can understand it would be complicated because you have State Department seeing one area, say nuclear non-proliferation, you have Commerce managing transfer and control of sensitive technologies. So, there are multiple kind of agencies that need to be involved. And so it could be just sort of feedback, adjustment on wording, things like that. But, it could also be bigger questions just around, common ground of how to allow Seoul to produce its own fuel, because there is this nuclear energy pact, would this have to be revised or a separate agreement? Washington basically can, holds the power to allow Seoul to enrich uranium for use in its nuclear-powered submarines. So, those seem to be some of the main sticking points. And even, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was here last week, and he kind of also mentioned, having to work with the state and energy departments. So, kind of implying that the approval process can't just move forward unilaterally. And this is also holding up the outcome of the security talks that Hegseth was here to do. They haven't also released, a final announcement about what they discussed, which is, wartime control, South Korean defense spending, et cetera. So that's holding up that as well. And, I would say, but probably the biggest question that I've been hearing is that it's also just about the location of where these subs would be constructed. And, I think we could follow up more with that. Yeah.
All right, let's take it from that. I'm going to expand on what Thomas has just touched upon, Stephen. There have been a number of conflicting reports with regard to the location of where these nuclear-powered submarines will be built. What more can you add to that?
Well, I remember that after the South Korea-U.S. meeting at APEC, Trump went on his social media page on Truth Social, and he said that he had granted this permission and that the vessels would be constructed at a shipyard in the U.S. city of Philadelphia that is owned by South Korea's Hanwha Ocean. And it seems like, despite him having said that publicly, and despite that, very much fitting into his preferred narrative, like that he is bringing investment back to the United States, in particular, like he is reviving the U.S.'s shipbuilding industry. Like he is using his influence abroad to convince foreign countries and foreign companies to do more business in the U.S. And I think President Lee kind of agreed with that in broad terms, but since then as Thomas alluded to, it seems like there are now differing perspectives, whereas you have South Korean officials saying that actually the plan is to build this in South Korean shipyards, which are much more advanced than like let's be honest about the reason that Trump is trying to revive the U.S. shipbuilding industry is because it was allowed to deteriorate for decades, really. It suffered from a number of things that made it a lot less competitive with countries like South Korea, Japan, China, and it has kind of, declined to a point where I think there are real questions as to whether or not like the necessary equipment and the necessary know-how are in place for a shipyard in the United States to like embark on something that's this ambitious and that requires. I'm not a shipbuilder, but I would assume that like building a nuclear-powered submarine requires some pretty advanced expertise. It requires some pretty advanced equipment, and I just think that a lot of that. I would say that there's two things. Just practically, like a lot of that is already in place in South Korea, and I think that a private company like Hanwha Ocean might feel more comfortable allocating their resources to a facility that they feel is more up to speed, that is better maintained, and just where they have a clearer idea of what they're going into, and that they would maybe not have to put as many resources to building up this facility just to get it to the point where it's production ready. But then just bigger than that, I mean, I think this. Probably the reason that we're talking about this is that it gets to a bigger question of the state of U.S.-South Korea relations, where it's like Trump saying publicly that he has convinced these companies to come to the United States and spend a lot of money there and create American jobs and to create kind of improve commercial conditions in the U.S. But the administration of President Lee saying domestically that they're going to do this investment in a way that they are filtering it through Korean companies, and they are as best as they can, they are using this as an opportunity to create more employment at these companies, and that this is going to be a real win-win sort of thing. Win-win is an easy thing to agree on in a political meeting, but it's a harder thing to make happen in business. So I think this will be an interesting conversation in the coming days and weeks.
Right. Well, amid the conflict over the construction location, Thomas, news of South Korea's potential advance into the global nuclear submarine club has grabbed the attention of the global media as well. What have you been hearing on the ground?
Right. Well, there has been a lot of attention to it. I mean, I feel like it's probably the main outcome of the summit from a kind of just a international perspective as far as the most sort of discussed aspect of it. And, some of that is, it focuses a lot, as Steven was talking about, it is kind of a window into the state of the U.S.-South Korea relationship. It shows a lot of the moving sort of parts of that. But, in a general sense, from the kind of military or defense perspective, it is also seen as it is seen as a big deal and kind of a milestone or a historic leap that kind of brings the alliance forward into a new place, and it also puts South Korea on another level, I think, militarily. Only a handful of nations have these nuclear-powered subs. It's just like Russia, China, U.S., France, Britain, India, and I guess Australia is kind of joining that club. So that puts South Korea in a pretty significant company, and so I think a lot of the coverage is, since we still don't know so many details, it's just kind of an analysis and speculation about what it means and what it may mean. But obviously, I think a lot of people are talking about just how it could change the sort of geopolitical balance and the naval dynamics in this region and allow South Korea to sort of play a bigger part in the Indo-Pacific region. It would give Seoul greater stealth and surveillance capacity, and this kind of blue water capability where you can get outside of just your own coastal waters. And so, the idea being that South Korea can sort of participate more in surveillance and just sort of burden sharing with the U.S. about concerns over what China's doing, as well as, of course, what North Korea is doing. So, it definitely seems to push South Korea into a greater level of sort of military capacity and responsibility. But also I think it just does raise these questions that are still unanswered. I mean, even about stuff like nuclear non-proliferation. I mean, the nuclear fuel is not necessarily, this is not something that, it's becoming a weapon, but it is sort of using nuclear power for something with a military, use. And, does that kind of start a little bit of a domino where that gets over some psychological barrier, perhaps, about allowing South Korea to process and enrich its own uranium. So there's some questions about that. And obviously there's questions, of course, about what it's going to mean for, neighbors in the region. I mean, certainly China hasn't said, I think, too much, but they actually seem to have pointed to that non-proliferation kind of argument about just staying within that. And, I think North Korea obviously, will have responses to it. And, I think, within South Korea too, there's just still a lot of questions about, nuclear governance, reactor technology, and even, setting a precedent for other allies. So it's one sort of story that seems to have reach onto a lot of different aspects. So it's being covered from a lot of different angles.
Right. And staying with the regional response then, Steven, what can you tell us about the response from South Korea's neighbor, Japan?
Well, I can say that Japan has a new defense minister. There's been a transition of leadership there. And the current defense minister, Shinjiro Koizumi, who just recently was agriculture ministry. I don't know how often that change happens where somebody goes from being agriculture minister to defense minister, but we should note that Koizumi comes from a very influential political lineage. His father was one of the more popular and successful Japanese prime ministers. He said on a radio program that following the news of South Korea getting U.S. permission to build these kinds of submarines, that he felt it was something that Japan also ought to consider. He didn't come right out and say that this was something that he was going to pursue or something that he was going to openly advocate for, but he thought it was something that the country ought to at least entertain the idea of. And the reasoning that he gave was he just felt that the regional security scenario was hardening and was becoming severe, I think was the word that he used. And he thought that Japan might need to buttress its own defense capabilities to cope with that. There's a few things that we probably need to note along with that. I mean, I would just say that given what I know about Japanese politics, it's a very consensus-driven way of doing things. It's hard for anyone in any individual figure in the Japanese political culture and system to push forward something that does not have broad-based support. So I would just say that for Mr. Koizumi to want to pursue that, I think he would have to be, he's an influential figure, but he would have to have the buy-in from the right people in his own party, presumably from Prime Minister Takaichi and all the rest. And I don't know if they have that. And I just think when you discuss anything nuclear, any kind of use of nuclear energy for a defense purpose within the Japanese context, you have to keep in mind that domestically there is a really strong aversion to that kind of use because Japan is as we know, is the one country that has been the direct target of nuclear attacks, and that has created a lot of kind of national trauma, a lot of suffering. And despite these nuclear bombings having taken place decades ago, they are still fairly close to the surface of Japanese society and Japanese officialdom as it pertains to these kinds of questions. So it's definitely worth noting that this is part of the national conversation there, but I don't think there are immediate signs that it will, anytime soon at least, that it will cross over into actual policy or actual practical, an actual practical endeavor.
Right. Moving from Japan then back to the US, Thomas, as you mentioned earlier, quite a number of pundits are saying that Mr. Trump's approval of South Korea's nuclear submarine ambitions was based on security concerns over China, as well as economic factors. What more can you add?
Right. Yeah, I would say, it can be a fool's errand sometimes to try and guess why Trump says what he says, or maybe does what he does, and then maybe turns around, and does something different or contradicts his own, statements or policies. But I would say in this case, this definitely aligns with, as you mentioned, some kind of, core goals that have been relatively consistent with, his administration. And certainly, just longer term in terms of the U.S. military in general, identifying China as the main adversary. I mean, that's certainly a policy that the Pentagon has had for quite a while. But I think within the Trump administration, the idea of sharing the defense burden, with allies, or having allies, take over more of that themselves, this fits very much into that framework where, letting South Korea take more responsibility for kind of policing its own waters, and as well as perhaps helping out in terms of, offsetting the potential threats from a China, and as well, giving South Korea perhaps greater ability to counter North Korea's activities, and all of these, North Korea and China are obviously developing their own naval capacities. So, it fits into that framework, and then, also the kind of economic and industrial factors. I mean, we don't know still, I guess, where these are going to be built, but another key concern of the Trump and the Trump administration has been to revive this shipbuilding industry. So the idea that and already we have seen Hanwha did purchase this facility in Philadelphia, and just in general having and there's this $150 billion pledge to invest in shipbuilding that came out of APEC. So, this also fits into this, it's a key kind of concern and issue for this administration. And I think just even in a general, bigger picture, it kind of reflects this sense of, it's like an economic diplomacy now. It's not just necessarily value-based or based on the history of the alliances, but, it's something where it's defense cooperation combined with, trade and industrial incentives, so it seems to really fit so snugly kind of into that framework. It's kind of this industrial security bargain. You build capacity, you invest, and, you buy U.S. tech. Some of it also, this trade deal is involving, South Korea purchasing energy from the U.S. So it's I think it fits very much into this kind of model of how this administration wants to do its, foreign and security and economic kind of diplomacy.
Right, Thomas. Meanwhile, Stephen, moving forward, President Lee Jae-myung's approval rating after the APEC summit, of course, soared past 60%. Quite a number of observers are linking that particular finding to his diplomatic endeavors during that multilateral event. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a reasonable conclusion. I mean, I think it makes sense that after the successful hosting of a major event like that the president's approval rating would tick up to some extent. I would say, and I would just to mention a few things that after having followed politics here for a long time, like a few things that I think I know about the Korean electorate and like how they might respond to this is I would say that the way that Lee carried himself in APEC, I think would play pretty well with the South Korean public, and I would just give a few reasons for why. Number one, I would say that he came across as very well prepared, and he came across as like clearly, whatever you want to say about the way that he was like super adulatory in his interactions with Donald Trump. I mean, that's clearly like an occasion appropriate and like a well thought out and a well prepared execution of foreign policy. I mean, like he greeted Trump and he interacted with Trump like clearly in a way that Trump responded well to, and he came away with what I think most observers would say was like a decent outcome, in that he was able to reach an agreement. He had a clear takeaway in the nuclear powered submarine aspect that we've been talking about, and then he was able to, just a couple of days later, he was able to have an equally or a similarly cordial interaction with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And so, we all know that the leader of this country has to execute policy very carefully to balance ties and balance interests in how it interacts with the U.S. and China. And I think most observers would say that Lee managed that pretty well. He came away with no, unlike certain previous presidents, he came away with no on-the-record gaffes or no, unfortunate or regrettable things. Lee's a smooth politician. I mean, it's something that I think when you see him interact in official settings, you can see that this guy's been doing this for a long time. He has a kind of natural way about him when he interacts with people. He smiles and he shakes hands and he comes across as pretty genuine. I think he's, of the countries that I've been observing in my time in this country, I think he's maybe the most natural politician. And I would just say that, this was, I think what he had riding on APEC it was his big chance to demonstrate his commitment to what he calls national interest-driven diplomacy, that he is going to execute his foreign policy just with the national interest in mind, not without fealty to any kind of ideology, without blind loyalty to any particular partner or any particular set of ideas, that he is going to make decisions and make plans in a way that he thinks directly benefits the South Korean public. And I just think that's a message that plays really well domestically. I think, a lot of people in South Korea are hurting economically. They have concerns about trade, and they have concerns about, how technology is changing the economy and a lot of other things. To have a president who's going to say, everything that I do abroad is going to seek to address those concerns and seek to make material improvements to the standard of living of South Korean households. I just think that's a message that makes sense to a lot of people. It's something that they want to hear, regardless if they are of a political conservative or progressive bent. And I think Lee, he did manage to demonstrate that at APEC. So it doesn't surprise me to see an uptick in his approval rating. The real question will be if he's able to sustain that. He is still only in his, I believe it's less than 6 months, isn't it? He took office in June. So South Korean presidents tend to have pretty strong approval ratings early in their term, and that tends to wane as things go along. So Lee still has a chance to try to be an outlier to that trend.
Right. In the meantime, his pragmatic approach, I believe, to diplomacy appears to be garnering him some great points with the public here. All right, Steven, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.